looks like people coming in has stabilized a little bit. And it's 2 after, and we've got a lot of content to cover. So I think let's get going. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, this evening, for some of you, early morning, afternoon, people from around the world. I really appreciate everyone coming and taking the time to join us today. So my name is Graham Bunton. I'm the director of the DNS Abuse Institute, and this is our second forum. The first one we held, I think in March or April, really tried to set the stage for what the landscape of DNS abuse is. And part of that forum, we got into a bit of a discussion about DNS abuse and what it is, and that led pretty organically to this forum. Our agenda for today is going to be, I'm going to take a little bit of time off the top to talk about the Institute and what we've been up to. And then rather than hear me editorialize on the topic of the definition of DNS abuse, we're going to go straight to our panelists. Thank you very much to the 3 of them for joining us today. That's Maciej Korczynski, Farzaneh Badier, and Mason Cole. Really appreciate them taking this time. Each of them is going to give us about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for discussion between the panelists and hopefully from you. If you have questions, you should feel free to use the Q&A pod, and we'll get to those questions after those 3 interventions. That's going to be the rough agenda for today. Why don't I start off a little bit talking about the Institute while I have all of you here. Hopefully you're all familiar with the Institute itself. We were created in February, so still relatively new by PIR to really tackle the issue of DNS abuse. And it's been a fun and very busy couple months from my perspective. I've done a boatload of outreach. I've talked to a lot of people, heard their concerns about DNS abuse, heard their ideas on how to combat it. And, you know, I've been sharing some of the vision for the Institute and some insights that I've had. And all of that is sort of accumulated in what I've been working on is a roadmap or an initial plan for the Institute. And I think that's just about done. The final finishing touches for that roadmap are actually coming from an advisory council for the Institute that we put together pretty recently, and we announced, I think 2 weeks ago now, where we have 12 just amazing people from around the DNS community and elsewhere that are going to be providing the Institute with insight and ideas and criticism, guidance on, you know, our strategy and initiatives. I had my first meeting with the advisory council on Friday. It was great. I ran them through the roadmap and the vision. We have a follow-up meeting later this week where we really dig into the substance and really get some of that feedback back from my advisory council. And then following that, I hope to incorporate that feedback and get this roadmap out and make it public so that all of you can see it prior to the ICANN meeting in June. And so that has really been consuming a lot of the work at the Institute, is really wrapping our brains around the problem space and figuring out what the best things that we can do to combat DNS abuse are going to be. But the completion of this roadmap and getting the input of the advisory council is really going to mark a change for the Institute, because this is going to be where we shift from planning to doing. And I'm super excited for this. It's going to be a really hectic and crazy next, 3 years basically. But a lot of work is going into this ahead of time to ensure that we have a very clear path, clear deliverables, measurable things that we can accomplish, and that we're going to make, the most difference on DNS abuse in the shortest amount of time. So I'm super excited for that. Yeah, and I think that's probably all I really want to share about the Institute and our activities lately. You've seen probably a lot of outreach. I would say stay tuned for another, maybe not full-scale forum, but some sort of public announcement of the of this roadmap. And we are going to work out some mechanism for public input on that. I don't feel the burning desire to recreate an ICANN style comment period, but sort of a core piece of the Institute is this collaboration, is going to be transparency and ensuring that people have the opportunity to look at our work and look at our plans and say, hey, I think you've missed a piece. Is going to be really valuable for us. So if you have strong opinions on what the work of the Institute should be, guess what? Your opportunity is coming up real shortly. So look forward to that, please and thank you. So why are we here today? If you were, as I said earlier, on our first forum, the chat often came back to the definitional discussion of what DNS abuse is. And I have found, and I made this joke on the Domain Name Wire podcast, that there's some sort of universal law of discussions of DNS abuse that they inevitably return to a definitional debate. And it occurred to me that there was going to be no way to avoid this happening. And so what we should really try and do is turn and face into it and really tackle it head on. And my expectation here today is not that we're going to get everybody aligned perfectly at the end of the day on a single definition of DNS abuse. I mean, I would love it if it happened. Let's try and do that, but it's not my expectation of where we will end up. What I do think we can do is have a great discussion, really dig into the weeds here, and come out of this on the other side with at least something to refer back to say, hey, if you really want to dig into the definition of DNS abuse and understand some of these issues, there was this great conversation that covers, a lot of the questions in this area. And, we can all start from at least a common place of understanding. So I've asked 3 experts in the field to join me here today. Thank you guys for joining. And my ask to them was to really try and define DNS abuse as they see it, but really do that in as concrete manner as possible, because a lot of these conversations I find happen in the abstract, where we are, talking about DNS abuse as sort of a vague idea. And what I really wanted to do today is to try and present examples to really show all of you and each other, what an example of DNS abuse looks like. What is the choice that a registry or registrar would have to make with this information? And I think that's going to help ground this conversation. So without, I don't want to run over anybody's presentation, but I think we find ourselves in this place for a couple of reasons, and maybe this is just helpful context for this discussion. The Institute has a definition of DNS abuse. It's the same one that ICANN contracted parties use. Briefly, phishing, farming, malware, botnets, and spam, where it serves the other 4. There is some history for this definition, some work from other places, including Internet Jurisdiction Project. We find ourselves in a world where registrars and registries generally want to, I think, and this was my experience as a registrar, limit the definition of abuses they were responsible for to ones that registrars and registries felt competent to tackle, that they could understand what was happening and make an informed choice. I think on the other side of this, that intellectual property interests and business interests see illegal activity all over the internet. It is a relatively anarchic space. Where hosting is entirely unregulated, but we have this centralization function in the DNS, and it's the only place to go address harms as they see it, this illegal activity that they see it, that also potentially involves like large Western companies. And so to me, the desire to tackle a lot of those harms at the DNS level I don't necessarily think it's the right thing to do, but I can understand how you get there. And then I think we have other interests like civil society, looking at the power that registries and registrars have over content, over freedom of expression, over the entire internet, and have reasonable concerns about increasing the scope of that power and increasing the scope of the decisions that registrars and registries should make. So there's a lot going on here, and I don't think anybody's concerns are wrong. But at the end of the day, we still need to figure out how to reduce DNS abuse, and we need to do that with as much as possible a collective understanding. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it over to our panelists. We'll have 3 interventions from them, as I said, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Feel free to use the Q&A pod for questions, and we'll get to those after the 3 interventions. With that, I think we'll go right to our first panelist, which is Maciej Korzinski, who's a professor at the University of Grenoble, and really blew me away on a presentation he did for the, I think the European Commission. I was like, oh, I have to get this guy on one of my forums. So here we are. Maciej, please go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, Graham, thanks a lot for the introduction. It's a really big pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I will show you a few examples, and I will try to also contribute a bit to the discussion on the DNS abuse itself. And here I will concentrate on the domain name abuse because this is one of the, I think, yeah, very relevant topic for this forum. Next one, please. So I will start with the current definitions of DNS abuse that are broadly accepted by different intermediaries, and those are definitions that were proposed by a domains and jurisdiction program, and also within the framework to address abuse. And according to those definitions, they define 2 types of abuse: technical abuse and 5 broad categories, as Graham mentioned before. So malware, phishing, farming, botnet, spam. And the second group, website content abuses, and more related to distribution of CSAM material, controlled substances and regulated goods, intellectual property, human trafficking, and so on. So those documents provide very a lot of very good insights into the problem, but here I will present and I will show you a few examples to highlight also their limitations. Next one, please. So here on the top, you can see the URL that was blacklisted, if I remember correctly, by Anti-Phishing Working Group. And below, you can see the phishing website. So according to those definitions, as phishing is one of the 5 broad categories, it should be technical abuse. But to answer this question, we need to investigate this one a little bit more. Next one, please. So here on the left, you see the same URL and the corresponding screenshot. And on the right, you can see the registered second-level domain name and the corresponding content. And as you can see, there is no meaningful content. The website shows forbidden. What's more, if we take a closer look at when the URL itself was submitted, and when we compare it with the WHOIS information, it was blacklisted. The URL was actually blacklisted 2 days after the domain name itself was registered. Next one, please. So that provides strong indicator that the domain is really maliciously registered. So this is technical DNS abuse, but it's also website content abuse, because there is illegal abusive content, phishing of credentials, trademark, copyright infringement. Next one, please. So now the question is, what intermediary should react? Next. So it should be DNS service operator. Next one, please. So registry operator, registrar, perhaps domain name reseller, but also hosting provider. And here we need to take one step back and take a look from the perspective of the attacker. Because if the registrar and hosting provider are 2 different entities, and if we just block the domain name because it's technical DNS abuse, then the malicious user can just go and register another domain name, perhaps even with different TLD, and point it to the existing hosting, malicious hosting. So this is the reason why it's, on one hand, this is technical DNS, but also website content abuse, and therefore we should react from both perspectives. So the domain name should be blocked according to applicable laws, but also the malicious content should be removed. Next one, please. So let's take a look at another example here. Again, on the top, we have URL that was blacklisted, I think, by Fish Tank. Below, you see the screenshot. It's, again, attack against PayPal users. So it is one of the 5 broad categories. It's phishing, so it should be technical abuse. And when we take a closer look, next one, please, then we see on the right that the content of the second level domain name is perfectly legitimate. And it actually corresponds to the domain name itself. When we take a look at the whois information, the domain name itself was registered in 2014, and it will expire in 2022. So is it really technical DNS abuse? Next one, please. No, it is a website content abuse. There is illegal abusive content, phishing of credentials, once more, trademark and copyright infringement, but the domain name itself is legitimate, but the website is compromised. When we take a look at the structure also of the URL itself on the top left, then we will see wp.include string that is a strong indicator that the actual website was compromised by exploiting a vulnerable WordPress content management system. Next one, please. So once more, the same question, what intermediary should react to mitigate this abuse? Next. Next one. And the answer is, sorry, the previous one, I'm not sure if we can. Definitely it should not be a registrar in this case, or generally speaking, DNS service operator. And the reason is it's completely legitimate website, and we do not want to cause any collateral damage to the owner of the domain name, owner of the website, and also to their clients. But it's not only the hosting provider, but perhaps it should be also the owner of the domain name itself or website master, depending, of course, if the hosting is managed or unmanaged. Next one, please. So here we see the database from URL House. URL House is a project from abuse.ch with the goal of sharing malicious URLs that are being used to distribute malware. So if we take a look at malicious URLs, next one, please, then we see that the great majority of those URLs are not abusing domain names. They're just using IP addresses. So it's only content abuse. URLs serve malware, so malicious software, to infect the end users, but there are no domain names involved. Next one, please. When we take a look at one of those URLs when there is a domain name, just by taking a look at the domain name, we could conclude that the domain name itself is actually legitimate, but it was compromised. So once more, we have only content abuse. We have no DNS technical abuse. URL serves malware. It's legitimate but compromised domain name, to be more precise, most probably website. Next one, please. And here we have an example where, once more, by taking a look at the domain name, it looks that it was maliciously registered. So in this case, we have a content and technical abuse at the same time. Next one, please. So on this slide, you can see a couple of fully qualified domain names that we captured in our spam traps. And those domains we did not observe in the content of the emails, but rather they were used to send emails. So they are maliciously registered. There is technical abuse, but they did not serve any content. So there is no content abuse. Next one, please. And more generally speaking, I would like to give you a few statistics that we produced during the COMAR project, funded by AFNIC and SIDN.FR.NL registries that we do right now in Grand Rapids University. What we did, we manually labeled domains that the corresponding URLs were blacklisted by OpenFish, Fish Tank, Anti-Phishing Working Group, also URL House. And we labeled them as either maliciously registered, the corresponding domain names, compromised, subdomain/free services, and also false positives, because some of those URLs had actually false positives, meaning that both the URLs and the domain names were perfectly legitimate, but they were identified as phishing. And what we can observe there, that after removing the third and fourth group, 58% of the phishing domains were maliciously registered, whereas only 42%, as many as 42% were compromised. So we cannot really blame or ask registrars to, for example, registrars or generally speaking DNS service operators to, for example, mitigate this abuse by taking down those domains, because that would be not correct. And we see very similar trends, for example, for malware distribution domains. Next one, please. So a few final remarks. Based on our experience, I think that we should define DNS abuse quite broadly, covering what is so-called technical and content-based abuses. And the reason is that there is no such clear-cut distinction between those two types of abuse when we really apply the top-bottom approach, and we say, for example, that phishing is technical abuse, and for example, registry operators should react on those. Or for example, CSAM is CSAM material is website content, is content abuse, whereas it can be, for example, hosted on maliciously registered domain names. So we really need, I believe, that we need more bottom-top approach and really investigate a little bit case by case and decide what kind of action should be taken. And also the question of the definition has to be somehow separated by the question who and what action should be taken. Probably the most important thing is that the focus should be shifted to the victims affected by abusive activities. And just to give you two examples, first is, there can be completely legitimate website that serves CSAM material, and perhaps it is not in the contract to, for example, take down such domain name. It would probably not be even appropriate, but that would be ethically something perhaps that could be an option for the registry operator to have this incentive that the domain, even though it's legitimate, might be blocked temporarily until the malicious content is removed. And final example is, from the victim's perspective, from the user perspective, they don't really know what's the difference between hosting provider, between registrar, between registry operator. But what they see, for example, as a victims or as a notifiers, they see TLDs. So even if the registry operator, and that's probably the first point of contact for those victims, and if they send such notification to the registry operator, of course, they perhaps will not take down the domain name, but they could facilitate the communication with appropriate intermediary, for example, the webmaster or the hosting provider, who could mitigate this type of abuse. So thank you very much, and back to you, Graham.
Thanks, Maciej. I really appreciate that presentation and what you bring to the table here, because it muddies the water so nicely. It really, I think, brings to the forefront the complexity of the problem that is in front of us, that it is not, and it is rarely so clean cut between that technical abuse and that content abuse. And that's a really interesting problem space that we find ourselves in. I don't want to editorialize between presentations, so thank you for that. And I think we're going to go right over to Mason for his intervention.
Thanks very much, Graham. Do you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you to the DNS Abuse Institute for inviting me. Graham, if I could have the presentation, please. All right. Thank you very much. I was listening to Maciej's presentation, and it seems like we have some commonalities in here. So I look forward to the discussion between the two of us and others in the webinar on where there's some similarities in our perspectives. So let me just dive right in. Next slide, please. Okay, what is the current situation? So DNS abuse obviously is an established phenomenon. If it weren't, we wouldn't have the DNS Abuse Institute, and we wouldn't have this webinar going on. We wouldn't have this discussion going on for so long inside the ICANN community and outside the ICANN community. The extent of abuse, though, has been debated pretty widely, and some of this is due to differing definitions. And I know we're going to have a healthy discussion on definitions. We already have, and that's going to continue. Other differences of perspective, depending on your effort to mitigate abuse, and differing sources of data. So there's lots of data out there that suggests either DNS abuse is a shrinking problem or DNS abuse is a growing problem, depending on your perspective. But where we do agree is that abuse within the DNS or employing the DNS for abuse is a significant issue, and it demands continual action. And that's why we're all here today. Okay, so about the definition of DNS abuse. So to some degree, it's recognizable on its own, regardless of how you formally define it. And this reminds me of a discussion that's gone on for years now here in the US, hearkening back to a US Supreme Court case called Jacob Ellis versus Ohio, where a US Supreme Court justice named Potter Stewart was asked to define the term obscenity. And he said, I can't define it, but I certainly know it when I see it. And I find that such is the case with DNS abuse. We know when we see DNS abuse, really, no matter how narrowly or widely it's defined. Next slide, please. So from a business perspective, and let me just say that part of my representation here is I'm chair of the ICANN business constituency, so I bring a bit of a business perspective to the discussion. So from a business perspective, the most useful definition from our point of view is one that ICANN enshrined in the registry agreement. That's the agreement between top-level domain registries and ICANN as their accrediting bodies. And that reads, distributing malware, abusively operating botnets, phishing, piracy, trademark or copyright infringement, fraudulent or deceptive practices, counterfeiting, or otherwise engaging in activity contrary to applicable law. Okay, thank you. I don't even have to say next slide. You're on top of it, Graham. Thank you. So further on the issue of the definition of DNS abuse, there really is no definition. There's no definition of abuse that ever is going to be suitably comprehensive, even in the ICANN sphere. As we've seen others contribute to this discussion on the definition, we see that many of them have said that the definition needs to evolve over time, or else abusive activity is going to exceed what's enumerated in contractual definitions or exceed what's enumerated by contracted parties or others. So let me make reference here to the Security and Stability Advisory Committee within ICANN, who wrote in their report titled SAC 115, which just came out a matter of weeks ago, where it reads, these categories have been adopted within the ICANN realm in specific contracts, but do not represent all forms of DNS abuse that exist, are reported, and are acted upon by service providers. New types of abuse are commonly created, and their frequency waxes and wanes over time. Thus, no particular list of abuse types will ever be comprehensive. You know, I come from the contracted side of the industry. I spent quite a few years with registries and registrars. I believe that what the Security and Stability Advisory Committee writes here is correct and accurate. And so accordingly, flexibility over time needs to be maintained in any definition of abuse, or we're going to find ourselves behind the curve in terms of what the bad guys are doing. So even with strict definitions, and further according to the SAC, efficacy of abuse mitigation is hit and miss. And again, in SAC 115, the SAC writes, handling of abuse varies widely across the industry, depending upon the practices of reporters and providers. This is a source of extended victimization, as inefficiencies and delays are common due to lack of universal standards for reporting and acting upon different forms of abuse. This is true. We still have quite a bit of disparity in terms of how we report abuse inbound to those who track statistics about DNS abuse, and to those who produce those statistics in an outbound fashion for the rest of us to consume and try to understand. Next slide. So it's not just the SAC that is concerned about a definition of DNS abuse. If you go back to the second Security, Stability, and Resiliency Review Team, this was called in ICANN circles SSR2, their final report was published 4 months ago, and it observes this challenge and makes the challenge of a definition of DNS abuse, and makes this recommendation. Establish a staff-supported cross-community working group to establish a process for evolving the definitions of prohibited DNS abuse at least once every 2 years on a predictable schedule that will not take more than 30 business days to complete. This group should involve stakeholders from consumer protection, operational cybersecurity, academic or independent cybersecurity research, law enforcement, and e-commerce. And I think this goes to the idea that what the SAC outlined, which is that definitions need to be flexible over time, and this is enshrining the idea inside ICANN processes in a way that may be productive. So now on the definition of DNS abuse, even governments are getting involved with the definition, where they examine the harmful act and whether the vehicle that led you there is DNS abuse. And this goes a bit to what Maciej was discussing just a minute ago, where you focus on the victim, where in this instance, you focus on the harmful act, the vehicle that led you there, and categorize that as DNS abuse. Now, this isn't necessarily a wider definition, but it is indicative of a trend in governments. And in fact, the European Commission, which has been extraordinarily active lately on domain name issues, is conducting a new study that's to be published later this summer, where it will focus on the European market and regulatory framework, but given the global nature of the phenomenon, it also will assess the broader DNS market and governance framework. The analysis will focus on DNS abuse both in relation to cybersecurity threats and to the distribution of harmful or illegal content. It will provide a comprehensive overview of the existing policies, applicable laws, and relevant industry practices in the field. So lots of people are getting in on the issue of DNS abuse. Some are zeroing in more on the definition, and we don't yet have consensus on what that definition looks like, except to say that in a lot of corners, it seems that it needs to be flexible and maintain its utility over time. Next slide, Graham. Thank you. So in terms of perspective, while non-contracted parties maintain and intend to continue to maintain good relationships with contracted parties, it's clear that additional effort is needed if ICANN is going to keep its authoritative position as the body uniquely positioned to deal with DNS abuse. Next slide. Okay, so stepping away a bit from the definition, let's take a look at abuse and work backwards from that. We can maintain that abuse is an action that defrauds in some manner. If we focus on the fraud and not merely the vehicle took, and not merely what we should focus on the fraud and not merely the vehicle that took the user to the fraud, that would be a more inclusive view of DNS abuse. So let me draw an analogy here. Let's say that somebody breaks into your house by using a crowbar on your door. Later, someone breaks into your neighbor's house by stealing the alarm code. Now, these are different methods to break into those houses, but you don't necessarily define the crime by only the method that was used to offend. What's more important to both to you and the authorities is that you both were defrauded. So you take that fraud and you work backwards from that to define what abuse might be. And this is the trap that we've fallen into for lots of years. We focused on the method of abuse versus the abuse itself. Next slide, please. Okay. So as Mate was talking about, we can divide abuse into different types. In this instance, I'm talking about technical abuse and abuse of content. So technical abuse is mostly what falls into contracted party descriptions, botnets, malware, phishing, farming, and spam that is used to deliver those other forms of abuse. Abusive content are things like child sexual abuse materials, violations of intellectual property rights, these types of things. So in terms of addressing content abuse, a hybrid approach can be best in so addressing. So sometimes, for example, a blunt force solution is warranted. For example, if you find a website that's distributing CSAM or selling counterfeit pharmaceuticals or otherwise endangering lives, registrars and registries tend to act on those egregious cases and clear violations of law. Now, sometimes these, if the blunt force solution isn't necessarily warranted, then sometimes it's better addressed by hosting providers who can go and excise the offending content while leaving the rest of the website generally, untouched. So the bottom line here is there is latitude to act beyond the current definition put forward by contracted parties, and that's what we're advocating. Next slide. Okay, examples. So here's an example of farming as technical abuse, and many of you probably heard of this case. It happened back in 2017. There were about 50 lookalike bank websites to which users were lured, and those websites were hosting malicious code. So the computer then would download a Trojan, and subsequently it would download additional files from a server in Russia, while all you would see was an error message recommending that you shut off your firewall and your antivirus software. So visiting any of those targeted sites with your infected PC would then redirect the user to a lookalike website that tracked account login information and sent that to the Russian server. Users were then redirected to the real banking site with no indication of what had just occurred, and attackers then used that personal information that was collected for identity theft, fraud, or to sell to other criminals. That's an example of technical abuse of the DNS. Next slide, Graham. And this is just a general diagram of what a farming operation looks like. I couldn't find screenshots for the specific example from 2017, but in the interest of providing a little graphic representation, this is what we have. Next slide, Graham. So further on example one, farming is technical abuse. Again, you can have a blunt force solution where you take down the lookalike websites housed at maliciously registered domain names, or you can have a nuanced solution where you cooperate with hosters to excise offending content. Now, I want to speak for just, if you could go back, Graham, one slide, please. I wanted to speak just briefly about the hosting issue. I'm interested in the fact that there's not as much cooperation between registrars, registries, and hosters as there probably could be in terms of getting rid of offending content inside a website. I think that's an opportunity for the industry to have some outreach to hosting organizations in a way that would be productive to try to do something further about DNS abuse. And I hope that the Institute takes up that challenge to advance discussions with hosting organizations as a way to do that. Okay, Graham, next slide, please. Okay, second example, IP infringement as a gateway to abuse. So again, you've probably heard somewhat about this. Often users can be baited with infringing content as a way to induce being victimized by malware or other types of harm. And you see this with various forms of content, books, films, music, what have you. You're attracted to that content, and then you're inside the trap, and you're subject to being victimized by malware or other forms of abuse. So currently, contracted parties define spam as a method of delivering other forms of harm as part of the abuse definition. There is an opportunity to add IP infringement or other content abuses as a delivery vehicle to the abuse definition, and then act accordingly. Next slide, Graham. This is an example of luring users in with content and then subjecting them to some form of DNS abuse. This is a science fiction book that is up on a website where you click through, and once you reach the content that you're looking for, it's probably already too late, and you're subject to having your machine infected or having malware downloaded, etc. So that's what these things look like. It could also look like, as I mentioned, it could look like movies or music or other forms of content. Next slide, Graham. Same example, just a different screenshot here, where you can download this content and at the same time you're subjecting yourself to the risk of being infected by some form of abuse. Next slide, Graham. One last example here. This again is a book. It's if you look down on the screenshot, you can see there's an abbreviated URL that you click on. Again, that takes you to a page where you're likely to be infected with malware. Again, using content as the bait. Okay, Graham, next one. Thank you. So one of the questions that Graham put to us as panelists was, how can registrars and registries make more effective decisions about what to do about DNS abuse? So one way to do that is to ask, is abuse occurring or not? And focus on stopping the abuse. We can look at what's inside and outside the definition, but when abuse is occurring, that's an opportunity to put a stop to it. And to do so, we need to make common sense decisions in cases of clear-cut abuse, regardless of the path to abuse. So it may be content or trademark as bait for abuse, which may or may not fall inside or outside the current definition, and but that leaves a swath of DNS abuse unaddressed. And again, there's an opportunity to expand arrangements with hosting providers for cooperation on excising problem content. Contracted parties can enlist trusted notifiers to bring egregious cases to contracted party attention. I don't know if you're familiar with trusted notifier programs, but they can be extremely effective and useful. And then help rapidly identify bad actors through a reasonable approach to who is accessed. That's a whole separate kettle of fish that I don't think we're getting into on this call, but I couldn't resist including it. Next slide, Graham. So in conclusion, again, what I want to say is DNS abuse is a known and persistent issue. To address it effectively, we need to work backwards from the manner of abuse to the problem. Definitions of abuse need to remain flexible over time and to capture all the paths to abuse. There's an opportunity to make common sense decisions in clear-cut instances of abuse. And then we should enlist others in our effort to combat abuse, like hosters and trusted notifiers. Next slide, Graham. Okay, that is it for me. Graham, thank you for the opportunity to present, and I return the floor to you.
Thanks, Mason. Lots to react to in there, so I'll try and keep it short. Hosting is clearly coming up a lot, and it really is a gap in this conversation that we need to have much better connections with that industry and really work on bringing them to the table. That's certainly something I'm thinking about as part of the DNS Abuse Institute's work, that's a real problem. I think that goes back to one of the points you were making in a slide there, Mason, about ICANN's role within DNS abuse. And to me, that's demonstrative of where ICANN's purview is just not big enough, and there needs to be something outside of that world that's digging into this problem. Could well be an institute with a handsome, charismatic leader like myself, or some other function. But we really need to make sure that we're engaging with CCTLDs, with hosting and cloud service providers to really tackle some of these problems. I want to keep digging in, but instead, what we should do is go over to Farzaneh for her intervention. Farzaneh, please. Oh, and just sorry, before you get going, reminder to attendees to use the Q&A pod if you've got questions for our panelists, which we'll get to relatively shortly. Farzi, if you don't mind, thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Farzaneh Badi, and I'm a research scholar at Yale Law School, and I was active at ICANN for a very long time. And I'm not obviously representing my employer in any capacity. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing 4 categories. And not all these categories are DNS abuse and can fit in the definition of DNS abuse. So we have the abuse of DNS protocol or the infrastructure itself, or you use the DNS protocol to abuse a node or a network. There's the abuse through registration of domain names, and then registration of domain names to carry out socially undesirable activities. So I'm going to go through each of these categories. So the first two categories, no, it's next slide, it's good. The first 2 categories is abuse of DNS protocol. And then this is when when the attacker actually uses the DNS protocol to carry out an attack. And then the attacker also attacks the DNS infrastructure or the protocol. So the important part of these categories is that we don't have a user involved who is like confused or fooled to click on something, or the user is not actively involved. Next slide. Okay, so the other 2 categories, there is the abuse through domain name registration. And it is very important to make this distinction about domain name registration. Where is the registration of domain names to deceive people, to gain access to their sensitive data, or do other attacks. And so, for example, you register Bank of America, and then there's the registration of domain names to undertake socially undesirable activities. And I will explain that in my examples what I mean. Why these distinctions matter? Because it is hard to identify the relevant actors that have the resources and the ability to solve the problem if we do not make these distinctions. So I think that our approach should go beyond just listing farming and fishing and all sorts of abuse to come up with a definition, but maybe this distinction would help with providing a more concrete definition. The other reason is that when we don't have these distinctions, we think that just by taking down the domain name on each of these cases, we are going to solve our societal problems, which is not the case. Not that domain name takedown is not always the solution to the problems that, to the DNS abuse problems. And then we put too much faith in automation and algorithmic solutions. And there is the intellectual property overreach that we disallow a lot of the domain names and activities happen because there is some kind of intellectual property component that we assign to a certain domain name. Next slide. So let's look at the examples of these four categories that I told you about. So Farzaneh wants to overwhelm her ex-partner's network so that he cannot marry his fiancée in an online ceremony. Now, Farzaneh overwhelms the group to be networked by a DNS reflection attack. This is when I use the protocol to attack a network. The groom can't get connected, so they postpone the ceremony. Now, it is very important to understand the role of the groom. The groom was not fooled into this and didn't marry Farzaneh instead, but the groom's network was attacked. And this is a solid technical problem. So the next, okay, so let's look at the second category. So Farzaneh is on the hospital bed. Farzaneh's automatic medicine injection happens through a service available on the internet. The service's DNS is attacked by the botnet. Farzaneh dies since she doesn't get the medicine. Now, again, the user here was not involved or fooled. The user didn't use a domain, was not confused by a domain name and go to the hospital. It is again a protocol and technical related attack. The next slide. So the third category is domain name abuse-ish, and I say, and I explain why I'm actually saying domain name abuse-ish, because we conflate this issue of having like a phishing attack and having like registering confusingly similar domain names in order to phish data or carry out technical attacks with the issue of providing illegal services and all that. So we call both of these DNS abuse. And the problem is that, and this is mainly because the intellectual property actors want to argue that this kind of domain name abuse is an intellectual property problem, while that is only secondary. It is not intellectual property infringement. The first is that it is a DNS abuse that can be used, that you can use a domain name to confuse people. And so let's go through the example. So Farzaneh clicks on the Bank of America eve.evo.com without knowing that Farzaneh is not actually in her own bank account. She gives away her username and password. Now, what happened here was that Farzaneh was confused. So Farzaneh comes into play here. She, like as a human, she made a mistake and she was fooled into clicking on that link. And this is, okay, so if we go to this next slide. And this is what the fourth category, which is illegal products, services, and content domain names that register to provide these things. And this is not in my definition of DNS abuse. This is absolutely not included. So Farzaneh likes Gucci bags. Farzaneh goes to the Gucci online store and buys a Gucci bag that is neither original nor safe. So if you can see that DNS abuse, the DNS protocol has not been abused in this instance, and the domain name is perhaps used to come, and I say perhaps used to confuse the consumer. The illegal actor might just want to be offering services like illegal services and illegal Gucci bags. But all the activities do not happen through the DNS and domain name. The consumer has to be engaged with retaining a service, a good, or see abusive content. So we see the active, the user actively gets engaged with this and is actually in our DNS abuse, in the attack landscape. Okay, so what should the registries and registrars do in these circumstances? And this is when I want to kind of like show you, and this, I think this point has been raised for a while, that when we are talking about DNS abuse, we are not only talking about registries and registrars, and sometimes registries and registrars can't even do anything about it. And so let's look at the dead Farzaneh. Registries and registrars can't revive Farzaneh, but they can work with each other and additional parties, other DNS operators, law enforcement, and other actors to almost completely eliminate the attack and help the service restore its network. The scorned Farzaneh, of course, the implicated registries and registrars can help with stopping the attack, or if not stopping the attack, restoring the network, and also like they can work with other actors as well. And the word implicated is very important in this instance, because it has to be the registries and registrars that are not implicated. They might not be able to do something about it. And then we have the phished Farzaneh, and so this can be, and this is the bankofamerica.com example, that they can take down the domain name. Now this is simplifying things, but and then the Gucci Farzaneh, which is not DNS abuse, and registries and registrars can, if they want to, come up with registration policies, but they should not conflate this issue with DNS abuse. Now, I'm not saying that we should not combat these problems, these societal problems and illegal activities, but what I'm saying is that we shouldn't and don't have to put these kind of activities and in the definition of DNS abuse. So my recommendations, next slide. Okay, so I recommend that we identify the DNS abuse landscape and the various actors in the DNS landscape, work on collective action to overcome DNS abuse. The registers and registrars are not the only actors that can help, and also law enforcement, courts, various cybersecurity networks can work together. And think of a DNS governance system that has an efficient but fair process for addressing DNS abuse issues. Because sometimes we have like false positives, sometimes we have problems with, taking, we need to also think about due process and providing some kind of remedy to the domain name registrant if they have been treated badly. And then also takedown should not be the measure of DNS health. We need to, we can't say just because we took down like 3,000 domain names this year, we have like a healthy DNS. We should think of other measures. And then also illegal activities that have a presence on the internet cannot be overcome by mere takedown of domain names, and they are not DNS abuse, so we should not consider them as such. Thank you. Oh yes, and you know my name by now since I made the examples. But anyway, yeah, thank you very much. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that we should not work against, combat those illegal activities on the internet. I'm just saying that let's not define them as DNS abuse.
Thank you, Farzaneh. What a delightful and hilarious set of examples. That was really different and unique, and I appreciated that. There's some interesting pieces that we've all had around who should be acting and when. If I'm going to editorialize about the definition as I see it briefly, as I get to do, I do think the sort of strict categorical definition that we're using does have its weaknesses. It clearly isn't good for adding or removing types of abuse as we see them. It's not very flexible in that fashion. And that's a bit of a problem. And I think going to Maciej's examples where everything is a resolved resource, whether it is the infrastructure for a botnet that is being used for command and control, or it's a hate speech site. And so then we're looking at how to draw distinctions in there. One of the things I've been thinking about and toying with a little bit is, and we've talked about the differing perspectives in how to approach the definition of DNS abuse. I've been trying to think about a somewhat inverted method of thinking about where is the best place for mitigating the harm that we see, and what are the attributes of good mitigation. Attributes for reducing harm could be it's quick, it's effective, it's precise, and it's proportional. And I think we often end up at the DNS because it's relatively quick and it's relatively simple. But we often find ourselves where it is not particularly precise, and it may not be proportional, especially where we might have a compromised website, which look to be a good percentage of the harm that we see on the internet. And that requires different solutions. Interesting stuff. There's a lot of complexity. I would like to open the floor to my panelists to see if any of you have a reaction to any one of each other's interventions. And then I will also remind people to use the Q&A panel in the Zoom room to submit questions, and we'll have some discussion. Mason, Farzi, Maciej, any reactions to start us off?
Well, I'll go first, Graham, if I may.
Please.
First of all, just want to congratulate the other two panelists because the presentations were excellent. I wish I'd thought of clever examples like Farzaneh did. I don't wish for a dead Mason, but but it was a very good example, and it illustrated the problem exactly correctly. So I just want to say thank you. I hearken back to Maciej's presentation in particular because there were a lot of similarities, I think, in thoughts and recommendations between ours. So I was gratified to see that. But Farzaneh certainly gives everybody, as she always does, a lot to think about. And I appreciate those examples because it really sharpens the discussion usefully about how we go about addressing DNS abuse. So I just want to say thank you to both. Excellent work.
Thanks, Mason. Farzaneh or Maciej, any reactions or substantive thoughts on the presentations or interventions from your other panelists?
Perhaps 2 comments. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities also with your presentation, Mason, and also for your presentation, Farzi. I totally agree that we need to think a little bit more than just about the domain names. The DNS abuse also consists of the attacks that I'm not sure if you name them, but things like distributed denial of service attacks, reflection attacks that misuse open DNS resolvers, where domain names are not included whatsoever in the attack itself. And other examples, of course. But also in my presentation, I tried to narrow a little bit down the scope to domain names, because this is something that that the great majority of intermediaries and stakeholders that are here also in the call are registry operators, registrars, perhaps hosting providers, but less, for example, ISPs, internet service providers, or mail service providers that would deploy, for example, I don't know, DNSSEC. They would close their open resolvers, or they would deploy correctly DMARC and SPF, to prevent different types of attacks. But I definitely agree with you that we need to also from time to time have one step back and take a look not only at domain name abuse, but also more generally speaking about DNS protocol and DNS abuse in general.
Thanks, Maciej. All right, so maybe we've got some questions coming into the Q&A, but maybe I'll start, I'll put this out there and see if there's a response. Do any of you think, fine panelists, that the definition changes or approach to this definitional problem changes if the regulatory world radically changes, in that hosting becomes a more regular or a more regulated space, that there is more accountability in hosting? Does that change the way we approach this problem?
So if I may say here, Graham, I think that there are a lot of efforts. Just to give the example of the Netherlands, when hosting, there are hosting regulations coming. Before there were a lot of initiatives, to find those rotten apples in the hosting market. But somehow also, and even I'm not sure if there were governmental actions on naming and shaming. I think yes, related to I think CISA material recently. But I think that those two groups, hosting providers and registry operators, registrars, are somehow, those two communities are kind of separated, also because of because all the meetings and discussions about the DNS abuse from registrar perspective, it is under umbrella of ICANN. That's my feeling. But there are a lot of, I think, initiatives, at least in the Netherlands, for example, when it comes to a hosting market. But perhaps bringing everyone to one table could help a lot also. I agree with this.
Thanks, Maciej. Mason?
So yeah, Graham, thank you. Just speaking in general, I think what you're starting to see is more governmental intervention into the DNS space, whether it's welcomed or not. And you're seeing this now with, it started with in a roundabout way with GDPR, and you're seeing, I think, at times governmental impatience with events happening in the DNS that tend to outpace their government's ability to keep up with them. And if we're not, and governmental interventions aren't always as smart as they could be, because there's this sort of, outrage out there, and governments tend to want to react, and regulators want to regulate. So it's up to smart people to get in there and do something about the problem before, governments come in with their sledgehammer and either overreact or overregulate or underregulate or miss the mark in general. So, to your question, is this going to change if hosting providers are more closely regulated? The answer is obviously yes. So as an industry, I think we need to be intelligent about how we go about addressing DNS abuse and have intelligent conversations with governments so that regulation, if and when it is applied, is correctly applied and correctly focused, so that we don't have an overreach problem, or so that governmental interventions don't miss the mark in terms of trying to help the situation.
Thanks, Mason. Farsi, did you unmute yourself? No? Okay, sorry.
Well, there are various networks and cybersecurity networks that they work together collectively to overcome the DNS abuse. And for example, in botnet mitigation, we saw a collective action in the case of Conficker, for example, and we don't necessarily need. I mean, well, I'm anti-regulation, so I'm gonna be honest about it. I don't like regulation, but I believe in collective action, and I think that we can bring people together and incentivize them to work with each other to overcome a DNS abuse. And this is exactly what I think the DNS Abuse Institute can do, to incentivize people to work with each other. And also my only concern is that because you use this term DNS abuse, and we use it at ICANN, we use the same term at ICANN, and we want to keep the definition very technical and limited to ICANN mission. So I don't recommend like getting involved with other stuff such as intellectual property infringement and broadening the definition, but that's my opinion, and that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Farzaneh and Mason. So I think there's an interesting thread here around, there's two. One is encouraging action without making it mandatory in some fashion, but preserving discretion so that registries and registrars can act on abuse where they find it, and where it may or may not be within this definition, but allowing them the ability to go and do that, and making sure that we have sort of the robust discussion around what that looks like so that there is some guidance. I think there's also something here about, and this goes back to Maciej's presentation, about the sophistication of response. And registries and registrars, as we all well know, have very limited tools at their disposal, for turning a domain name on or off, essentially. But there are circumstances and harms where we need to have better tooling. And I think Dean Marks has asked a question in the Q&A panel, and I think it's in the chat thread as well, around this distinction between hijacked or compromised websites and maliciously registered domain names. And it would seem to me, and I think this is part of his suggestion, is that in circumstances where we've identified circumstance of abuse as compromised, what has mitigation looked like there? And is there success in reaching out to the registrant or website owner to mitigate that harm? And I guess we would need to understand what percentage of that mitigation is successful. And, is there a threshold where that's so low that we should actually begin to act at the DNS level? And maybe that's a question for Maciej, because I think probably you have you're closest to that sort of problem. Do you have any thoughts on that, Maciej?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks, Dean, for an interesting question. First of all, I think that this distinction is very, very important, because if we have maliciously registered domain name, we might not want to contact the registrant, because we might be simply contacting the attacker himself. And the question is, yes. So who should react when there is a compromised domain? It's a very, very good question. And if you ask this question to the hosting provider, he might, he might say, you should go to our client, because for a few years we've been developing reputation metrics for hosting providers in the Netherlands a few years back, and there are some hosting providers that appeared in our reputation metrics very, very high. But can they act on those? One of the biggest provides, for example, business to business, and works in business to business model, which means that he's not there are resellers, sometimes chains of resellers and they don't even know who is the last party that, you know, really the hoster that should react on this. But that's for sure that the very starting point should be the hosting provider, and perhaps he should try to identify the person who is behind the hosting. And now another thing that is quite important there is if the hosting providers provide managed or unmanaged hosting. If the hosting is managed by the hosting provider, so he provides the software on the website, very often the websites are compromised using the vulnerable software. So they should in first place patch those to prevent compromising those domains. But if the hosting is unmanaged, it means that the entire you know, the operating system, all the software on the server and on the websites is run by the webmaster. And in this case, it should be more a registrar/hosting provider that is reacting on the abuse. But I do not have an answer to the question of I'm not sure that the question probably answered. The question from Dean, what is I think the percentage, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure anymore, but are registrars website operators generally able to fix the problem and stop the hijacking of the domains? Yes, they can. Registrars, especially website operators, either website operators or hosting providers, depending if the hosting is managed or unmanaged, they should be able to fix and stop compromising the domain names, because very often there are some vulnerabilities that the attackers exploit. So they should really take care of patching their servers in first place. And if it's already compromised, then they should remove the content, the malicious content, malicious URL, without suspending the domain name itself, and then also identify the problem, how it was hacked, and then patch the vulnerability. What is also interesting from time to time, I'm talking a little bit long, but what is interesting also, from time to time, we've seen cases where the same hosting was compromised by multiple attackers at the same time. And you could see the same domain name with multiple URLs that perhaps were used by even different entities. So this is very important that in cases when we have compromised domain names, then it's a hostmaster/hosting provider that should react in the first place. And one last thing, a kind of a corner case here. Sometimes there is legitimate benign registration, but the DNS service itself, it's not a website that is compromised, but sometimes DNS server is compromised by itself. For example, by performing, I don't know, let's say domain shadowing attacks, where there is completely legitimate domain name, but the attacker compromised the registrar account, and he will start, for example, adding subdomains that will be used in attacks. So in this case, but as mentioned, those are corner cases. From what we see, the great majority of cases are website abuses. Sometimes we have indeed DNS technical abuse, but definitely in both cases, the domain names should not be taken down. That was long, sorry for that.
That's okay, thanks, Maciej. There's a lot in there. On that last corner case, I think we get into a world, adjacent world of like DNS operator security and ensuring that registries and registrars have platforms that are secure and using two-factor and are able to identify proactively when people are maybe accessing accounts that they shouldn't be. And I know there are people thinking on that, probably not core to the Institute, at least not right away. We have plenty of other issues on our plate. We've got about 8 minutes left, and I'll save 2 or 3 of that just to wrap us up. Maybe an observation, as we've been talking quite a bit about hosting, I engaged with the RIPE anti-abuse community relatively recently and talked about the problems in the DNS industry around DNS abuse. And the numbering community, at least that particular one, basically had all of these same problems. They had difficulty with getting timely abuse reporting, with well-evidenced abuse reporting, with best practices on how to respond. And it seems to me that that's probably true for hosting as well as numbering, as well as the DNS, that there is lots of work that needs to be done across all of these spaces to make all of us better. And my hope is that the work of the Institute will be easily adaptable to those other spaces where we have those overlaps. Let's see if there are any other questions. There's a couple more questions in the Q&A pod. There's one from Gopal that I don't quite understand about binding the symbolic names and IP addresses. Maybe if you could elaborate in the chat or in the Q&A pod again, Gopal, that would be appreciated. Where is another question that's going to be appropriate for us today? There's a question here from Shiva about in matters related to DNS, isn't there a wide gap between traditional processes and the speed of the internet? Would it help if there is abuse mitigation, abuse response processes somewhat internal to the DNS that do not have to wait for traditional processes, which are time consuming? I'm not sure what he means here specifically by traditional processes, but my sense is that in cases of maliciously registered domain names, frequently the harm is happening very quickly, sort of hours from registration to days, and that taking days to respond, you are maybe too late. And so what are the processes that help resolve that? And I think that is probably, and now I'm out over my skis a little bit, but more timely abuse reporting, where it's thorough and well evidenced, and cleaner processes within registries and registrars to deal with that abuse. Did anyone else have of my panelists have a response to that particular question? Going once.
I'll give it a shot, Graham.
Please.
Well, I think the question highlights a reality that and I'm not sure exactly what's being referred to as traditional processes, but let's say it deals with traditional law enforcement activity or jurisprudence that deals with criminal activity or whatever. Then yes, the harm that can happen on the internet and within the DNS can happen at nearly light speed. And the ability to keep up with those harms may not match that speed. So, we've seen this now for quite a long time. You can go back to 1998 when the U.S. Congress passed the anti-cyber squatting measure, where they made it a crime in the U.S. to cyber squat on a trademark term. And that was in reaction to people cyber squatting on trademark terms, and had been for quite some time. So it takes a while for regulation and regulatory bodies and courts and law enforcement and others to keep up with what's happening in the criminal world. And thus, I think the need for us to focus on what is the harm in the DNS, how is it happening, and work backwards from that harm and try to address it as quickly as possible. And then, do we have the tools available to us to address those harms? And, again, I don't want to get into a whole separate policy discussion, but, there are tools that aren't available anymore that used to be. And that causes a slowdown in the addressing of harms. And, whether that's, whether the regulation is good or bad, that seems to be a fact. So it's going to be a constant challenge for the good guys to keep up with the bad guys. And I think it's always going to be the case. And more the reason for us to collaborate as extensively as we can on tools that speed up the ability to deal with DNS abuse. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Mason. And that balance between timely response and thoroughness of investigation is a really interesting one. And something the Institute is going to be quite focused on is the quality and timeliness of that abuse reporting, ensuring that registrars and registries have the information they need when they need it to be able to act on DNS abuse in a timely fashion, to try and reduce that time that abuse is out there and available. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'll just see from my panelists if there's any last closing thoughts from any of you before we wrap this up.
Graham, maybe 2 cents from me also. I definitely agree. One of the, I think, limitations of the blacklists are that, you can subscribe as a registry operator, registrar, but then you're left alone. You need to collect the evidence by yourself, and then you need to react on this. So things like providing more evidence on abuse, I think that could lead to better decisions and faster also mitigation. So totally agree.
Graham, I also have a comment, just like, so I think that, yes, traditional processes are might be slow and might not work, but we need to also look at, we need to discuss this based on evidence, how slow they are, how much harm as a result of the slow process is actually taking place. And let's not forget the rule of law. Fast and furious is not always good. It has effect on our freedom of expression, our civil liberties, and I think that we need to be, and this is why I make those distinctions when it's technical. When it's a technical abuse, you might be a little bit more certain than when you have a human involved, and we are not really, I don't think we are in the business of regulating human behavior, as Wolfgang said. Thank you.
So we're just about out of time. Maybe I think I've got some quick slides here, which is really just a thank you to my panelists, especially. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to put together those thoughtful presentations and come up here and speak. And it's a big ask, and it's not easy. So thank you to each of you. Thank you to everybody who's attended today. I appreciate you coming. There looks like there was some great conversation in the chat, and for people to submit questions. Thank you for our hosts at Circle ID and everyone at PIR and Verge who helped put this together today. I greatly appreciate everybody's assistance and help in the matter. And I hope this was interesting for everybody. Clearly there is lots to do. These are still some big questions, and we've now, I think, made them bigger and fuzzier for everybody. If you want to engage, please feel free to email me directly, find me on Twitter, the Institute on Twitter, and join us for keeping on this topic. We're going to keep working. We're going to reduce DNS abuse. We're going to have a good time doing it. Heads up for our upcoming roadmap. Stay tuned for that. And we'll talk to all of you hopefully again soon. Thank you, everyone.